The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We have now seen a preview of the first Charlie Hebdo satirical magazine cover, the first after the Paris massacre that took place where a dozen or more individuals were killed. The magazine will be released tomorrow. They have obtained funding to print something like several million copies when normally only 60,000 or so are printed in each run. And this is the cover, for those who are not watching us but rather listening, is a cartoon, again, of the Prophet Muhammad holding an I am Charlie sign, Je suis Charlie, also with the words, all is forgiven in French. So when I saw this, Lewis, I have to admit I had somewhat mixed feelings in the sense that I completely support these satirical magazines. I support free speech. I am fundamentally opposed to any violence being done to those who are doing satire or drawings based on the fact that you think it is a sin to draw the Prophet Muhammad. I mean, I hesitate to even clarify my position on that because it should just be so completely obvious. But at the same time, I worry that choosing this may be seen as an attempt now to go beyond just this is satire and it's what we do, but more to deliberately inflame. And I just am concerned that it might bring more backlash that at this point is the last thing anybody needs.
I think, I mean, how do the terrorists who committed this attack, how do they measure victory, right? Was it a victory just because they got in there and killed a few people? The magazine's still operating. Would it have been a victory if there were no more pictures of Muhammad published?
Right, if that was the standard, if the goal of the attack, if the success of the attack is measured by whether they stop any more Muhammad drawings from being published, clearly the cover is a sign that they have lost, and I completely recognize that that's an important thing. But as some people have emailed me, there's a difference between supporting free speech, even speech that is unpopular, and deliberately using free speech simply to offend people. So I like satirical drawings of Muhammad, of whoever we're talking about. I support satire. I support satirizing religion. Of course, I support all of that. But given the circumstances, I have a bit of concern that this may be done, that this may have unintended repercussions.
I'm sure they considered that, but I think that this is a very clear way to show to the radicals, to the to the fanatics, that they have not won. I think this is the only way you can really do that.
Well, no disagreement there. The message is loud and clear that they have not won, and that is a message that that everybody should be very clear about. After the Charlie Hebdo satirical magazine attacks in Paris, unsurprisingly, remember that there was also a second attack connected to the same perpetrators at a kosher market in France. Anti-Semitic conspiracy theories exploded surrounding the Charlie Hebdo attack. Now, aside from the typical false flag claims of a kind of general false flag, the specific anti-Semitic hypotheses also are of significant concern to me. US-based anti-Semitic conspiracy theorists were blaming Israel specifically for the attacks, claiming that this was just a Jewish war against Islam. And there were a bunch of actual media outlets in Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, Egypt, Tunisia, and India, which put out pretty similar types of messages. I'll just give you a sampling of these, okay? Mark Glenn. Mark Glenn is a known anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist. He wrote on his blog, The Ugly Truth, that, quote, the massacre in Paris is yet another false flag event aimed at reigniting and reinvigorating Judea's declared war against Islam. On Veterans Today, which is a US-based website which puts out anti-Semitic conspiracy theories as news, Gilad Atzmon, who's an Israeli-born anti-Semite based in London, claimed that France somehow deserved the attacks due to the actions that were pushed for by, quote, the Jewish lobby group CRIF. He went on to say, it is quite probable that this was another false flag operation. Who could be behind it? Use your imagination. Couple of other examples. Kevin Barrett, an anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist and contributor to Iran's English language propaganda network Press TV, wrote an article in that same publication, Veterans Today, titled Paris Charlie Hebdo Attack, Another Zionist False Flag? You can more or less imagine the details that were there. And you might say, David, but those are just lone nuts. There's no actual media outlets of any serious stature publishing this stuff. Well, sadly, you would be wrong. In India, Mother Jones reported that the International Business Times India published an article that suggests that the Mossad, Israel's equivalent to the CIA, was to blame specifically for the Charlie Hebdo massacre in Paris. In Tunisia, the Tunisia Times posted an article a few days ago called, quote, American Resources, the Mossad is behind Charlie Hebdo operation in France. In Jordan, Rawafed News published an article by Assad al-Azoni titled The Tragedy of Satirical Charlie Hebdo, Search for Jews and the Extreme French Right Wing to be Behind It. And lastly, in Lebanon, Middle East Panorama Media and News Agency put out an article called Charlie Hebdo, O Arabs, Beware of the Zionist Trap. And of course, West Bank and Gaza media outlets, we don't even have to list the number of anti-Semitic conspiracies there. What's your reaction to this, Lewis? I have to admit, I am rarely surprised when anti-Semitism or blaming the Jews is pulled into stuff, but it actually caught me by surprise with regard to this incident.
I doubt even half the people who are claiming that this is a false flag attack actually believe it. I think that, yes, they probably hate Jews, and I think this is all really an attempt to make sure that there is no sympathy for any Jews in this attack and Jews who might have been killed in the market. I think that's really what is at the core of this.
Remember that poll that surveyed the Middle East and North Africa and found that 74% of those polled in those regions harbor some degree of significant anti-Semitic attitudes. You know, at the same time that the tragic massacre in Paris and in that kosher supermarket, kosher market happened in France, that led to over 12 people dead was happening, a huge massacre was happening at the hands of Boko Haram. There has been another shocking death toll in recent days, with reports of possibly thousands of people massacred by the Islamic group Boko Haram. Boko Haram is a self-professed Islamist movement based in northeast Nigeria. They have activities in Chad, Niger, and Cameroon as well. And months ago, we covered, Lewis, the story of Boko Haram kidnapping hundreds of young girls from a Nigerian school. And now we have, unfortunately, tragically, numbers that are making those seem absolutely tiny. There was a huge massacre in Baga, Nigeria. It was such a big massacre that the defense troops have now stopped counting dead bodies. They estimate the total dead are somewhere around 2,000, but there are so many dead that they simply have stopped counting. The attackers sped into the Nigerian town with grenade launchers. Obviously, people in the town scattered. Residents were hiding under brush. Bullets started piercing them. Some tried to seek refuge in their homes. Many of those homes were burned, and many of the people burned alive. And many who tried to cross into the neighboring Chad drowned while trying to swim through Lake Chad. Those who survived the attack and swam to Chad are now stranded on Kangala Island on Lake Chad. Tragic, Lewis, and not nearly the coverage of the Paris massacre. Why do you think that is?
I think in part it's just a timing thing. If there's a story like the one in France and a story like this one happening in Africa, I think it's pretty clear which one is going to get the most media coverage, despite this one, of course, being a much larger massacre. I think it's just timing and really just the region and the type of story it is.
And there's something else here which we observe when we talk about why do we get news every day from the White House press briefing room and the Pentagon, even if there's no real news, when we have actual news happening elsewhere? Well, you already have reporters who just are sent there and wait for news to happen. And in the same way, much easier to do coverage of cosmopolitan Paris than it is what is happening in Baga, Nigeria. And it really is tragic that this is not getting the news coverage that it deserves. Boko Haram continues to strengthen. 4,000 was the estimated size of Boko Haram just 5 or 6 years ago. Estimates are now that the group has swelled to 6,000 to 8,000 individuals. And just yet another example of how the default corporate media structure that exists and that really is accepted without much critical thought by the majority of individuals, because let's face it, people are busy. They're busy with their families and living their lives and earning a living. This is just widely accepted as this is just how corporate media is, and it really shouldn't be. We should be hearing way more about what has been happening with Boko Haram. Also, we haven't heard much about an ethnic cleansing done of Muslims by Christians, which has now been confirmed by the United Nations, and almost nobody seems to care. A UN commission of inquiry says it has found evidence of ethnic cleansing of Muslims in the Central African Republic. It stopped short of saying that this qualifies as a genocide. There are specific definitions of what is ethnic cleansing and what is genocide. But no question that this was indeed an ethnic cleansing. The commission's final report was released a few days ago. It says that the death toll estimates range from 3,000 to 6,000, that all of these numbers are, quote, radical underestimates of the people killed in fighting that continues between Christians and Muslims in what is a very poor, landlocked nation, the Central African Republic. The 3-member commission accuses both sides of war crimes against humanity, but accuses the anti-Balaka Christian militia of ethnic cleansing of Muslims. The UN has classified this a top-level humanitarian crisis. Very little coverage of this, Lewis, either. And we know that there is this disproportionate focus on Muslims committing terror and religion and ethnicity-based violence. But this is a very specific example where this Christian group is now confirmed to have been involved in the ethnic cleansing of Muslims. Very few news articles in the U.S., no real serious coverage of this.
Like this story, like the Nigerian Boko Haram massacre, like what was happening in Darfur, I think that people just say to themselves, hey, that's Africa. That's what happens in Africa. This is happening everywhere over there. And perhaps we shouldn't cover it. Perhaps it's not as interesting to people because of that, because it's just assumed that this is the state of things over there.
When the right-wingers ask for modern examples of Christians doing violence against non-Christians, don't forget this incident, because this is one of the top humanitarian crises as determined by the United Nations. Follow me on Twitter, twitter.com/dpacman. We'll be back after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to The David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show membership program is the #1 funding source of our show. Please consider becoming a David Pakman Show member at davidpakman.com/membership. Today's new member of the day is Rebecca Cordaro. Rebecca Cordaro, thank you for being a David Pakman Show member. Because of the success of the David Pakman Show membership program, our program continues to grow and thrive, and we really do depend on members to support us. Go to davidpakman.com/membership. Anti-police sentiment was pointed to as the explanation for why we have seen the killing of police officers here in New York City. The Eric Garner and Michael Brown protests were singled out as catalysts for that anti-police sentiment. Minorities, poor people, urban liberals, they're angry with police and they're really bad people has been the narrative from the right. But wait a second, We have a story of three white men, militiamen from Rome, Georgia, who are now accused of domestic terrorism for conspiring to obtain explosives. They are facing domestic terrorism charges because they were planning to use those weapons that they were acquiring against police and government agencies. The FBI learned that Terry Eugene Pierce, Brian Edward Cannon, and Corey Robert Williamson were discussing using guerrilla war tactics and wanted to launch attacks against Metro Atlanta police stations and government agencies back in 2014. This information was just made public. The determination that they will be charged with domestic terrorism was just announced. They were also trying to recruit others to carry out similar operations in their respective home states. They were going to target roadblocks, TSA checkpoints, sheriffs and police conducting operations outside of what they considered to be the Constitution. Any national coverage of this? By and large, no, Lewis, no. Who covered it? Well, I did a search as of a couple days ago. The Northwest Georgia News wrote about it. SouthCoastToday.com, the Troy Record, the Penn Bay Pilot, the Belfast Telegraph. Not exactly making the headlines you know it would make if the characteristics were, instead of right-wing militiamen who happened to be white, if they were, Muslim whatevers that we always hear about, the coverage would be drastically different, and we would be hearing on all the right-wing networks, as we always do, that Muslims are the problem. Whereas here, three right-wing militiamen, white men are never the problem, Lewis.
There is that aspect of it, but there is also, and this is just the nature of the business, media that is, that had they been successful, there might have been a story. But when these attacks, these plots are thwarted, are discovered beforehand, it tends not to be news.
There is no question that that is a factor, but I do not believe for a second that that justifies such a drastic contrast in terms of the caliber and quantity of coverage.
I agree. There would be certainly more coverage if these guys had bad guy skin color, as what's her name on Fox News called it.
A pastor at the Bible Baptist Church in Hasbrook Heights, New Jersey, is now under fire after his church posted a video of him having claimed to convert a, quote, smart aleck youth by, quote, punching him in the chest as hard as I could. This is Pastor Eric Dammann. He starts by saying he met a young man in Calgary named Ben who was a nice kid but kind of too smart for his own good. I'll let the good pastor tell you the rest of the story.
There was a young man in Calgary. His name was Ben. And I was running a youth group. I was there for a few years. And he was a nice kid, but he was one of those kids that was always he's a real smart aleck. Was a bright kid, which didn't help things, right? Made him more dangerous. And we were outside one day at youth group, and he was just trying to push my buttons, and he was just, kind of not taking the Lord serious. And I walked over to him, and I went, bam! I punched him in the chest as hard as I crumpled the kid. I just crumpled him. And I leaned over and I said, Ben, when are you going to stop playing games with God? I led that man to the Lord right there. There's times that might be needed.
Lewis, I guess we could say he successfully beat Jesus into the boy, right?
I think so. That's usually it's just a figure of speech, but here, yes. Did it work?
I don't know. The guy seems to claim it did. When I hear that term youth group, that he was the youth pastor, something about that really makes me cringe when I hear about this is the specific youth pastor. He knows the best ways to talk to the youths about Jesus and about God. The entire concept, for whatever reason, makes me cringe.
It does. But wouldn't that mean that he's kind of perhaps not the best at brainwashing, since it's easier to brainwash youths? So maybe the people who have to brainwash the older folks are the ones who are better at it. Yeah,
maybe so. And look at the language that he used, interestingly enough. He was a bright kid, which didn't help things, made him more dangerous. He had to be sort of dumbed down, Lewis, with a punch to the chest. I think that the pastor might be lying, just telling the story to kind of get some kind of reaction from people, or is telling the truth and he's just too dense to realize that he's admitting to assaulting a child, which is, of course, a crime.
Yeah, of course, this guy's not very bright. Bright enough to realize that a kid who's intelligent is a danger to his false teachings.
No, he certainly picked up on that. And conversion by abuse is obviously something we've seen before.
We've seen it countless times, yes, but rarely do we have someone confessing to it in front of a congregation.
Yeah, rarely is it the type of thing that you see those doing the abuse bragging about it in semi-public situations, no question about it. Remember that story from a few months ago from Albuquerque, New Mexico, about police shooting dead a homeless man who seemed to be mentally ill, who had nothing but a couple of little knives with him? We now have heard that those police officers will be tried and they have been charged with a crime. We now heard that the two police officers, former detectives Keith Sandy and Dominique Perez, actually Officer Dominique Perez and Detective Keith Sandy, will be facing murder charges in the death of James Boyd, the 38-year-old man in question. He was killed in the foothills of the Sandia Mountains on the east side of Albuquerque following a standoff. There is a video of this where Boyd appears to be surrendering to police when police shoot a stun grenade at him. The smoke eventually clears, and Boyd is holding two small knives in his hands, after which police shoot him several times after yelling at him to get on the ground. Police then tell him to put his hands to his side and drop the knife, to which Boyd replies that he cannot move. I'm going to read to you the statement from the lawyers for the officers, which strikes me as just an insane statement. Quote from Sam Bregman, the attorney for Mr. Sandy. Quote, to the contrary, he followed his training and probably saved his fellow officer's life. However, Lewis, as we know, the video does not suggest that these officers' lives were in danger, and we will now see this in front of an actual court if it is not dismissed pre-trial. We will actually get to hear more about why it was the officers felt their lives were in danger.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but these were federal charges, right? Now, this was a federal investigation, and so it was not the Albuquerque prosecutor pressing these charges against the police officers, right?
That's true. There's always this concern, which we've talked about, when it is local prosecutors investigating police, that you have an inherently kind of unfair circumstance where almost always the prosecutors and police are allied and working together. And all of a sudden, those same prosecutors are now looking into police as possible perpetrators. And I believe Lewis is right that these were federal charges here. And hopefully, that will remove some of this cloud of cronyism that has existed so much in recent investigations of police officers acting improperly.
And we'll see if that video is what makes the difference here as we follow police cameras. It does look to me in the video like they probably could have just used a taser or some non-lethal weapon on the guy. The
Albuquerque police, of course, involved in more than 36 police shootings since 2010. Per capita, per population, a lot of police shootings happening in Albuquerque. Next, we will speak to Claire Headley, who was in the position of deciding within the Church of Scientology whether Tom Cruise had successfully passed his counseling. That's next.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm joined today by Claire Headley, who was born into Scientology, worked at Scientology headquarters as a Sea Organization member for 15 years, and escaped in 2005. It's truly an incredible story. Let's start at the beginning, Claire, if we can. Some people choose to join Scientology sometime during their lives. You were born into Scientology. Tell us about that.
Yes. I was born in UK. And my mother had become my mother had become a member of Scientology when she was pregnant with me. And so, sorry, give me a second here.
Your cat seems very interested in our interview.
Yes, she's like all of a sudden wants to be front and center. Okay, so my mother became a member of Scientology when she was pregnant with me. Her brother actually got her into Scientology. And so when I was born, she was already a member of Scientology. And as a result of that, Scientology was never my choice. She and my father divorced because of Scientology when I was around 2 or 3. My father had been in Scientology and decided he wanted nothing more to do with it. So they divorced, and I've never spoken to him since. And meanwhile, my mother then joined the Sea Organization when I was 4, at which point she became full-time. She was working very long hours, and I essentially became a ward of the Sea Organization. At that point, I was initially in their nursery, very long hours from, morning until late at night.
And for people who might not know, how would you characterize the role of the Sea Organization within Scientology? Is it sort of the control structure?
Yes, it's the management, and it's also the Sea Organization is essentially runs all the inner workings, the upper management, for any of the advanced levels, they're all delivered by the Sea Organization. They guard the upper materials of Scientology, and they run all the management of the lower organizations and all the many different organizational pieces of Scientology are then managed by the Sea Organization.
And when your mom joins the Sea Organization, is essentially a full-time Scientology staffer, and you, of course, are kind of pulled into that world, is there a point at which you, as a child, start to be kind of made aware that, listen, there are people who are not Scientologists who might be critical of what we do, or in some way they may look down upon what we're doing? Were you kind of prepared as a child for the conflict that might exist when you tell people you're a Scientologist?
Absolutely. That's, I would say, practically it's a huge part of the indoctrination. Where I was in UK was at St. Hill, which is the headquarters for UK of Scientology. And even though my mother was in the Sea Organization, I went to a public elementary school. And so I was very used to hearing, things like I would get called names because I was a Scientologist. And I a few times asked my mother why that was, because I didn't understand. And the way she explained it was, oh, well, there are bad people who have said bad things about Scientology. And, of course, she just preached to me that sticks and stones can break your bones, but words can never hurt you. But I was very aware that there was a lot of conflict and different views. On the other hand, also a huge part of that indoctrination is that people who say bad things about Scientology are very bad people.
And how old were you, or how did the transition happen to where you started taking on roles of responsibility in the Sea Organization?
Okay, so I was in the cadet organization from age 5 until age 10. Those were the years that my mother was in the Sea Organization, and the cadet organization is essentially where children at that time were then groomed to become Sea Organization members. So we were taught many of the different basic principles of Scientology. We were made to study them every day after school and learn the tenets of the way to happiness. All different basic pieces of Scientology we were taught at a very young age as part of being kind of prepared and oriented to being a member of the Sea Organization. That also included being required to sign a billion-year contract at a very young age. I think the first contract I ever signed, I was age 8, and some of my friends were younger than that. And the the premise was that the only ethical thing to do is to join the Sea Organization, and obviously that's what we were being groomed for in that cadet organization. So therefore, any one of us who kind of expressed any idea of not joining the Sea Organization was considered to be a troublemaker and a bad person, since obviously the whole orientation was that what we needed to be doing was preparing for and then planning to join the Sea Organization. Anyway, all of that said, my mother ended up leaving the Sea Organization when she got pregnant with my sister. She still remained a Scientologist, and she went through some pretty heavy-duty handlings when she left. And at that point, I still continued my training in Scientology until the age of 16, which is when I then, quote unquote, reported for duty to the Sea Organization. And at that point, I did what's called the EPF. It's the state's project force, where you do heavy manual labor, and you're on a very rigorous schedule, and you're kind of put through a short period of indoctrination as a Sea Org member. And after you successfully graduate from that, then you are assigned a position as a Sea Org member, and that began my career as a Sea Org member at the age of 16.
So I want to you alluded to pregnancy and Scientology, and that's something I want to get to in the second part of our interview. But to kind of continue this thread for now, yes. We interviewed Marty Rathbun some time ago, and he talked about his involvement in I guess it's called the auditing of actor Tom Cruise, who's a Scientologist. And correct me if I'm wrong, you were sort of supervising Marty Rathbun's auditing of Tom Cruise during this time. Is that correct?
Yes, I did play a role in that, more so from the view that if Marty if there was determination that he needed correction on something in that auditing, then I was doing that correction.
So talk to us about how that happens, right? So who comes to you and says, listen, Claire, we're getting some weird readings on Tom Cruise. We need to bring him in. I mean, how does this all develop?
It's more that when you're... The process of counseling in Scientology is it's pretty defined and specific in terms of they do auditing sessions, and there's a very specific list of steps that are supposed to be executed in any given auditing session, and then that's then carefully reviewed both on video and in the worksheets. Worksheets is just a written running record of anything that Marty, the auditor, or Tom, the PC, pre-clear, said during any given auditing session. So there's a written record, and there's also a videographic record of any session. And those are both then reviewed, and if something was deemed that it didn't go as planned, then the auditor, meaning Marty, is then corrected on that.
And what would be something that doesn't go right? Just to give us some, a couple of innocuous examples. What would be these red flags that would be identified?
So let's say by the end of a session, the PC, the pre-clear, Tom, he's not as happy and bright as he should be. Let's say that's an example, or it didn't the process that they were running didn't go smoothly and maybe bogged down and ran into a wall.
So while you're overseeing Marty Rathbun's counseling of Tom Cruise, at a certain point, bearing in mind Tom Cruise has paid a whole bunch of money to be in the Church of Scientology, he's been brought in for this counseling, at a certain point you're supposed to kind of sign off on Tom Cruise sort of being good to go, but unfortunately that wasn't what the report warranted, right?
Yeah, there was a specific, well, there's many different roles in Scientology auditing. The main one is the auditor. at the end of every session, the auditor takes the PC, the pre-clear, to an examiner, and the examiner has the PC pick up the cans for the e-meter and observes the PC's needle. And there was a specific time when I was the examiner, and Tom did not have a floating needle. So I marked that and said, thank you very much. And that was deemed a huge red flag. However, subsequently, I was overridden by David Miscavige saying, no, everything's fine. He's good.
So based on what we now know to be just kind of pseudoscience, I don't even know what to call it, that is used for doing these evaluations, Tom Cruise had not actually passed, so to speak, and you determined that, but David Miscavige ultimately overrode your conclusions.
That's correct. Yes.
All right, let me remind the audience, we're speaking with Claire Headley, born into Scientology, worked at the C organization within Scientology. We'll take a break, and when we come back, we will talk about a lot more with Claire. Stay with us.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Absolute horror, Lewis, for those who believe in science, rational thinking, and the scientific method, as Senator Ted Cruz has been appointed to oversee NASA. This is truly, truly scary. We need more funding for NASA. We've talked about how important space exploration is, not only because of the importance of exploring space, but because of the intangible benefits, the space-related discoveries that can benefit society at large. And we've been long advocating for increased funding for NASA. And now we have Republican Senator Ted Cruz stepping up, apparently, I use that term loosely, to chair the Senate Subcommittee on Space, Science, and Competitiveness. Ted Cruz has a long record of climate change denial with regard to the impact of human activities on the climate. He has pushed for regular government cutbacks when it comes to science and space exploration and this type of spending. And he also has promoted himself as a sort of Tea Party spending hawk who wants to slash budgets wherever he can. And very often with these guys, Lewis, it is the type of spending like NASA that is first to go, while, of course, we have to continue expanding defense spending. In July of 2013, Ted Cruz tried to amend a spending authorization bill so that it would reduce the amount of funding for NASA. It is already written on the wall what Ted Cruz's attempted influence on NASA will be. It is just terror.
This is the guy whose dad thinks that evolution is impossible.
Right.
This is what we need here is, maybe with Republican control, NASA's going to get slashed anyway. I don't know. But what we need is NASA and scientists all over the country to come out against this and speak out about this and hopefully try and change it, because this is an abomination.
I wish we could have, is it too much to ask, Lewis, just to have qualified people running their respective committees on in the House and Senate? Is that just too crazy to desire?
Shouldn't we have qualified people in House positions in the first place? What does it matter what committees they're on if they shouldn't even be there to begin with?
If tomorrow's headline is that NASA has received increased funding to work on a new project to prove that the Earth is actually at the center of our solar system, I think we'll all know who's to blame.
Right, or some type of study to try and prove that the Earth is flat. Anything goes with this guy.
Climate Progress revealed a few days ago that more than half of the Republican members of the new Congress either deny or question what we know to be the overwhelming scientific consensus that humans are impacting the climate on this planet. And if you look at just the Senate, the numbers are even more appalling and dangerous. 72% of Republican senators are climate deniers to some extent. 72%, that's more than 7 out of 10. And what's more, This analysis from Climate Progress shows that many of the congressional committees that deal with climate and energy issues are loaded with with global warming and climate change deniers. We told you in the last segment that Ted Cruz is going to be chairing NASA, the committee that decides on NASA's budget, the Space Science and Competitiveness Committee. We also know that 68% of the Republican leadership in the House and Senate deny human-caused climate change. 13 out of 21 Republican members of that Committee on Science, Space, and Technology, or 62%, reject the consensus science on climate change. I am just out of words, Lewis. We have committees. Forget about the fact that it would be great not to have any members of Congress that are so against what the scientists who work on these issues tell us. I'm beyond that. We're going to have that. At least give us committee members when it comes to issues of science and reason, etc., who are not overwhelmingly opposed to what scientists are telling us, but we can't even get that in committee.
Not even close. I think it's safe to assume that no matter what the scientific community is telling these the elected officials on these committees, these deniers are never going to stop denying that this is a real thing, that climate change is happening, for, at least to protect their sponsors. That could be happening too, whether they believe it or not. They're either going to deny it because they believe that, or they're going to protect big business.
And I would love to say that these committees actually don't do anything and that there's no risk whatsoever to having people like James Inhofe involved, who said that God just wouldn't allow climate change to happen, in charge anywhere. These Republicans are going to try to further hamper the EPA's ability to restrict pollution. These are the same Republicans who, like possibly Ted Cruz, have voted in the past slash funding for NASA, and I would not be surprised if they try to do it again in the future. It's shocking that they are even allowed to sit at the adult table.
It is. It's very unfortunate. Unfortunately, this is the state of things. At least we have a consensus among scientists, and I think a lot of Americans can actually see what's happening.
If only the point of view of the constituents were reflected by the actual elected officials. But I know that's too much to ask, Lewis, in this kind of representative system that we have. We do have a voicemail number, which you can call 24 hours a day. The number is 219-2-DAVID-P. I received a voicemail from the Eggman about our segment yesterday about Don Lemon asking a Muslim human rights attorney whether he supports ISIS, and at first being shocked by the question and then realizing that Arsalan Iftikhar, the human rights attorney, didn't really deny supporting the ideology of ISIS. Here's what the Eggman had to say.
Hey, Dave. I think Arsalan Iftikhar is a terrorist trying to disguise himself as a human rights lawyer. I think your assessment of the interview that Don Lemon did with him was 100% correct. I think Don Lemon's follow-up questions should have been, so, how do you feel about the Jews? And I think Lewis can't even pronounce the guy's name. That's why he said that guy is probably not a good guy. So, Lewis, try to pronounce the guy's name. But, shalom, little brother. Yo.
Yeah, so very, very mixed reactions. Some feeling that we were being unfair to Arsalan Iftikhar. Others just not understanding that when Lewis said that Arsalan Iftikhar may well sympathize with the ideology of ISIS, that would be, as Arsalan Iftikhar himself said, separate from supporting violence. And then some people who just straight up agreed with our analysis, like the Eggman. Keep the voicemails coming. 219-2-DAVID-P on today's bonus show. The program doesn't have to end now. If you want more of our show, become a member. You'll get access to the bonus show, where today we will discuss men who post selfies tending to be more psychopathic, according to a recent study, the Connecticut cancer chemo case, as well as Miss Bum Bum and injections gone wrong. What is that about? Rest assured that Lewis will tell us on the bonus show. He is the host of the bonus show. I am the sidekick. And you can sign up and get all of our great member benefits at davidpakman.com/membership. Speak to you then.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.